Bulgaria is one of the poorest countries in the European Union. It also controls a raw material so valuable that people have spent 300 years trying to steal it and fake it. That material is rose oil, a key ingredient in the perfume industry, used in everything from drugstore body sprays to the great French perfume houses, whose most exclusive fragrances cost hundreds of dollars an ounce. Almost all of the world's best rose oil comes from two valleys in central Bulgaria. The rose behind all of this is a specific variety called the damask rose, grown mainly in two valleys south of Bulgaria's Balkan mountain range, the Kazanlak and Karlovo valleys. Growers there produce rose oil of a quality nobody else has matched. Rose petals are less than 0.1% oil by weight, and it takes 3 to 4 tons of petals, or roughly 1 million individual flowers, to produce a single kilogram of oil. And this is all before accounting for timing. The petals have to be picked before sunrise, while oil content is highest, and distilled within a few hours, or the aromatic compounds will start to break down. Producers have refined the extraction process over centuries, but the yield is still tiny, and a kilogram can run anywhere from $9,000 to over $16,000 depending on the year's harvest and the market. Nobody has quite managed to replicate the oil synthetically. Imitation and partially synthetic versions exist and get used in cheaper products, but at the top end of the perfume industry, the real thing hasn't been replaced. French perfume houses, the ones building the fanciest, most expensive fragrances, still rely on actual Bulgarian rose oil. It's a luxury good controlled entirely by geography, with no real substitute. The damask rose isn't actually native to Bulgaria. It comes from further east, likely Syria or Persia, and arrived sometime around the 16th or 17th century, brought in through Ottoman trade routes. Bulgaria was, at the time, an Ottoman province, and the rose ended up planted in the Kazanlak Valley. It absolutely took off, growing better there than anywhere in its native range. The valley quickly became the empire's rose oil supplier, occupying its own profitable niche. Rosewater and rose attar produced here were sold across the Ottoman world and beyond. By the 1800s, a class of Bulgarian rose merchants started traveling internationally, selling to buyers in Paris and Vienna while their own country was still under Ottoman rule. For a people with basically no other route to money or standing on the world stage, the rose became something close to a national symbol. That's a strange thing to say about a crop that mostly ends up as a fragrance note in a perfume someone else makes, but it's true. By 1903, the industry had grown enough that the town of Kazanlak threw a festival for it, a public celebration of the rose harvest that doubled as a show of civic pride and a charity event. It became an annual thing, still going, still held every year in Kazanlak in early June, though it's grown into a much bigger production than the original event was. The boom didn't last, however. World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II all slammed the rose industry. By the end of World War II, only about 23% of the rose plantations that had existed in 1917 were still in operation, and the whole industry was pretty much on the brink of collapse. The end of the war would save the industry, however. The post-war communist government nationalized the land and merged the scattered rose farms into collective and state farms, same as it did with everything else in the economy. Bulgaria followed the Soviet model closely, but rose oil got a special role inside that system. Export of it became a state monopoly, run centrally, and the entire point of it was acquiring hard currency. A socialist economy that couldn't sell much of anything else to the West could sell rose oil to French perfume houses, and it did, for cash the government badly needed. The plantations, the distilleries, the quality standards, the sale abroad, all of it ran through the state. It's worth remembering what this state monopoly was actually built on top of, though. Bulgaria didn't need communism or a new government to become the world leader in rose oil. By the 1930s, the country controlled around 75% of global rose attar production, and the industry employed something like 200,000 people. The state mostly just took over an existing monopoly, but they did invest heavily into it too. The Institute for Roses, Essential and Medical Cultures had actually been founded back in 1907 under the Tsardom of Bulgaria. Through the 1950s and 60s, though, it did some of its most useful work, breeding new rose varieties bred specifically to survive harsher winters. The government's reach went all the way down to the local distillery. In the town of Tarnachena, a family-owned rose oil operation got nationalized in 1947 and kept running under state control for 2 decades until 1967 when it was converted into a museum. The family didn't get it back until 1992 after the whole system had collapsed. When communism fell, the state monopoly that had run rose oil for 45 years dissolved, and there was little to replace it. The fields and factories were handed back to the descendants of the families who owned them before 1944, through a restitution process that returned confiscated land to its pre-communist owners. In practice, this meant handing a highly specialized, labor-intensive business to people who, 2 generations later, mostly had no idea how to run it. A lot of them had never tended a rose field or distilled a drop of ottar in their lives. Fields that had taken decades to establish were abandoned or dug up and replaced with something easier to grow. Distilleries were left abandoned, and you can still see a few of them standing empty along the roads through the valley. This was happening at the worst possible moment, because Bulgaria had already lost its grip on the top of the market a few years earlier in 1983, when cheaper ottar from Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and China started flooding in. The competition was getting stronger exactly as the Bulgarian industry lost the one structure that had been holding it together. For a while in the 1990s, it genuinely looked like the whole thing might just end. The industry did survive into the 2000s, driven by family businesses again, the same basic unit that had built the industry in the 1800s before the state ever got involved, this time with a large assist from EU funding once Bulgaria joined in 2007. Bulgaria's loss was to a large part Turkey's gain, however. They were in the best position to capitalize on the near failure of the Bulgarian rose industry. Ironically, Turkey's rose industry was quite literally grown out of Bulgaria's. Rose oil production in Isparta, the region of southwest Turkey that's now Bulgaria's main rival, was reportedly started in the 1890s by an immigrant from Kazanlak. The 2 countries now dominate the world between them, together producing somewhere around 80 to 90% of the global rose oil supply. They do have different niches in the market, however. Turkey mainly competes on volume and cost, running a big, efficient, lower-priced operation. Bulgaria, unable to match their low prices and sheer volume, opted to go for quality and name recognition. The Bulgarian Valley has 300 years of reputation behind it, and the specific claim that its particular microclimate produces an oil nobody else can match. In 2014, the EU granted Bulgarian rose oil a protected geographical status, the same kind of designation that protects Champagne or Parmigiano Reggiano, meaning the name is legally restricted and can't be slapped on oil grown somewhere else. If you can't be the cheapest, at least make sure you're the only one they're allowed to call the real thing, I guess. The process used in Bulgaria to actually turn the flowers into oil is fairly unique. Mainly, steam distillation is used. Fresh petals are packed into a still, traditionally made of copper, and then water and heat is added. The steam pulls the aromatic compounds out of the petals, rises, hits a cooling coil, and condenses back into liquid, which separates into oil floating on top of the water. There's a problem with this, though. You only yield about a quarter of the potential oil. The rest of it doesn't end up floating, and stays in the distillation water that is considered waste. So, Bulgarian artisans figured out you don't treat that water as waste, and instead give it more passes through the distillation process, and something called cohibation. A lot of the aroma lives in compounds that dissolve into the water rather than floating out as oil, so if you skip the second distillation, you get oil that smells incomplete, thinner and off than what is expected from rose oil. This multiple distillation process was borrowed from the traditional process of making fruit brandy, or rakia. The twice distilled water left behind doesn't go to waste either. It's bottled and sold as rose water, the same rose water that's been coming out of this valley since the Ottoman Empire. Perfume gets all the attention, but the rose has more uses beyond this. The oil itself turns up in cosmetics, skincare, soaps, lotions, creams, makeups, and in pharmaceuticals, where the rose has a long history as a traditional medicine. Then there's the food side, which is where a lot of the cheaper byproducts go. Rosewater flavors Turkish delight and baklava, and Indian sweets like gulab jamun. Persian cooking also uses it in rice dishes and drinks extensively. In Bulgaria, the petals are often put into jam, jelly, sweets, and liqueur, and processed rose products get used as flavorings and coloring agents. Being one of the most prominent and expensive oils in the world comes with problems. Rose oil is also one of the most fake substances in the entire fragrance industry. When a kilogram of something sells for the price of a small car, and when the real thing is nearly indistinguishable from cheaper lookalikes, the incentive to cheat is enormous. The margin between real rose oil and fake oil can run over 1,000%. So, people do fake it, constantly, and in a whole range of ways. At the crude end, the oil just gets diluted, cut with a cheaper vegetable oil to stretch it. More cleverly, it gets blended with other, cheaper essential oils that happen to smell rose-adjacent, mainly geranium and a grass called palmarosa. At the far end, some are just geranium or palmarosa with a rose label. Authentic rose oil is verified by its chemical fingerprint, the specific proportions of a few marker compounds like citronellol and geraniol. What makes this hard to stop is that the fakers know exactly what the labs test for. Adulterators buy those exact compounds from cheaper sources and spike their fakes with them, hitting the target numbers a basic test looks for. This has forced authentication to go to an almost absurd level. Labs now catch palmarosa in rose oil through carbon isotopes. Palmarosa is a grass, and grasses photosynthesize differently than the rosebush does, which leaves a different ratio of carbon isotopes in the molecules. That ratio doesn't change with blending or distillation, so even a 5% cut of palmarosa leaves a fingerprint you can't hide, at least not yet. It's become an arms race between the people faking the oil and the labs authenticating it. Bulgaria still sits on a secure, legally protected niche, supplying most of the world's high-grade oil. The thing about having a product controlled entirely by geography is that you're also quite dependent upon that geography. The whole system depends on a specific, delicate set of conditions, and climate change is causing these to shift. The Rose Valley runs on a delicate cycle. It needs a cool, gradual spring that lets the bushes bloom in waves across a 3 to 4 week window, giving the pickers time to harvest them at their individual peaks. In 2024, the blooming started nearly a month earlier than usual, after a mild winter and a warm spring rushed the whole cycle forward. Warm springs make the flowers open all at once instead of in waves, compressing the harvest window greatly and reducing yield. Recent heat waves have killed many flowers outright and made the remaining roses produce less oil. This has resulted in erratic year-to-year swings in output, and thus, prices. The industry is largely underprepared for this new threat. Less than 1% of Bulgarian rose farms have any irrigation at all, and the rest are entirely dependent on the weather. The investment needed to change that runs well beyond what a typical independent farm can afford. To make things worse, energy prices spiked after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the distilleries run on gas and diesel. Fertilizer prices jumped too. Labor, the single most expensive part, is entirely manual and getting more expensive every year. The whole thing still comes down to people manually working over rose bushes before dawn, picking flower after flower by hand. It's a process nobody's been able to automate yet. The most valuable agricultural product in the country is still largely gathered the same way it was centuries ago. A picker working a morning shift, roughly 5:30 to 10:30 in the morning, gathers something like 30 to 50 kilograms of blossoms and earns approximately 25 to 30 euros for it. That's the labor going into a product worth thousands by the time it's finished, and it's still the biggest cost for the farms. Picking has to be done by hand, has to be done fast, and it has to be done in a narrow window of time at dawn, which means a grower needs a lot of people for a few intense weeks and can't spread that cost across the year. The cost of that labor has only gone up, while what the farms net from finished rose oil has stayed the same. The person growing the roses gets squeezed between a purchase price that won't rise and labor costs that won't stop rising. The economics of the most valuable crop in the country are, for the actual farms, surprisingly precarious. Bulgaria, quite recently, has made some moves to protect the industry. On January 31st of 2020, the law on the oil-bearing rose took effect, with the stated purpose of protecting the oil-bearing roses grown on Bulgarian lands. The law set up a public national register under the Ministry of Agriculture, listing every rose producer, processor, production site, and plantation in the country. Growers have to report new plantations and destroyed ones every year. Blossoms can only be bought under a written contract between a registered grower and a registered processor, with the law defining many aspects of these contracts. It also regulates how the finished products get labeled and set up an advisory council for the sector. In 2021, the year after the law took effect, rose blossom production fell by 33% and oil production fell by 60%. Profitability for the farms went negative as well. Some perfume houses reacted to the price swings by keeping rose oil in the fragrances they'd already built around it and leaving it out of new ones, which is the kind of thing that doesn't look hopeful for the future of the industry. As of 2026, growers, processors, and the government are all in negotiations to revise the law. The obvious move, if you wanted to break Bulgaria's hold on it, would just be to take the rose and grow it somewhere cheaper. It's a plant. Anyone can just grab a cutting and walk out of the country with it in their pocket, and plenty of people did. The damask rose is now grown across a huge stretch of the world, namely Turkey, Iran, Morocco, India, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia, though often under different names. These names include the Turkish rose, the Isfahan rose, and the Taif rose. But despite these countries having many advantages in some domains, none have been able to quite dislodge Bulgaria's place in the market. The problem is that you can't produce an identical oil with different growing conditions, even if you have the exact rose variety you need. Plenty of these places make a good product, some of it very good, but it still isn't Bulgarian oil. The rose seems to have pretty much outlasted everything thrown at it. It survived the Ottomans, a kingdom, communism, and modern mismanagement. This is also roughly the same list Bulgaria itself survived. The empire that brought the flower here is gone, so is the kingdom that came after it, the state that seized the fields in 1944, and the system that abandoned those fields in 1989. That's probably why the rose stuck as the national symbol through every one of those governments. It even ended up on the 50 leva banknote in 1951, under a communist state that had no particular affinity for traditional imagery. The rose kept being the thing Bulgaria pointed to, no matter who was in charge. For 300 years, the threat to it was always political, some empire or government deciding it wanted the trade for itself. The threat now isn't a government at all, but warm winters and a spring that shows up a month early.
Абонат с такъв номер не съществува.